Matthew 17. We'll begin reading in just a moment around verse 24. We'll start at verse 24. You know, there's a lot of things to be taught in the Bible about the miracles of Jesus. And there's been a lot written, too. Brother Jimmy Jividan had written a book about the miracles of Jesus. He made the observation that all of the Gospels call the miracles miracles, but the Gospel of John calls them miraculous signs. And what that means is when you go down the street and you see a round sign with a cross on it like this, what does that mean?
Train coming?
There's a train, yeah, there's train tracks. Yeah, you can even walk up there and see the tracks where the train went, right?
Yeah.
But it's always 1,000 feet behind the sign. So usually a sign comes first and then the event. When you see a cross on a sign like this, what do you think? What's that a sign of?
Side road entering.
Crossroad, right? Intersection. I had one of my students at Rochester say, that means there's a church up ahead. It's not a cross. It is a kind of a cross, but it's an intersection. But the intersection is always 1,000 feet behind the sign. So what we're getting at is the fact that when we look at the signs in the Gospel of John, Jesus is not performing the miracle to heal somebody as much as he is trying to teach them something, right? That's why John calls them miraculous signs. Oh, Matthew 17, beginning around verse 24. We'll start there in a minute. How many of you, Tom, you won't remember this. Tim, Drew, you probably won't remember this. But when I was a kid, there were signs next to the road that were spaced out about 500 feet.
Burma shape.
Thanks, Tom. Okay. I was going to say that, but that's all right. And what did the signs say?
It was a funny joke, really.
Yeah.
I had to deal with shading, but it also had
Yeah.
kind of a funny annotation as you went down the road. You could see the next
Yeah.
line.
When you get up in the morning, next one, what do you see in the mirror? You know, there's always a phrase, and people are trying to say, okay, what's the next one going to say? Burma Shave made a fortune off of that. That was their advertising, you know? So, Tom, you and I remember that. They don't do that now, you know, that I know of. I've never seen it.
Costs too much to rent the sign.
Cost too much. I don't know. They were only about this tall. But, yeah, it does cost to put those signs up. But the point is, there's something behind the sign, and it's always at the end. The last one, Tom says, Burma Shave. It's an advertisement about that, and everybody remembered it. Everybody remembered it. Except the people that weren't born yet. They don't remember that. But that was cutting edge back then. You know, that was AI back then. Everybody thought, whoa, this is something different, you know. When we were kids, it's funny because in 2019, the church in Fort Myers said, we need somebody to lead our small groups. Because when you have 800 people, nobody knows each other. So they kept, every elders meeting, the preacher, Randy Simmons, said, we need to find somebody like Russ Bone to lead our small groups. The next month, we need to find somebody like Russ Bone to lead our small groups. Then Randy says, why don't we ask Russ Bone? Well, they don't do that anymore. Now they say, we need to find a young Russ Bone. Things change, you know, as you get older. Different things. But that's how it is at our age when we think of those signs, those Burma shape. That was in the 60s probably, wasn't it? Maybe 50s?
50s and 60s.
50s? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
I couldn't read back then, but my parents would tell me what it said. It's funny because now I was thinking about my age. Sign language, yeah. Smoke. I was remembering back when my parents used to send me to school with no water bottle, no iPhone, no snacks, but somehow they knew we would survive to the end of the day.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
They
Yes.
would drive you in a car to school.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I never got a car ride.
Yeah.
We always walked.
How many did not walk 2 miles to school? Raise your hand.
I was-
uphill there and back.
That was about a mile and a half, maybe.
Uphill.
Yeah, uphill
There and
both
back.
ways.
Both
Yeah.
ways.
In the snow.
Absolutely.
Oh, man. But things change, you know. We get to the age where, where we're thinking about this. And one of the things that came up about this miracle is the fact that Jesus is trying to teach us something in Capernaum. Now, I showed a picture of Capernaum not long ago. The dock in the Sea of Galilee is only 100, maybe 200 feet outside of the gate. But this miracle is such that Jesus is trying to teach us something here. So let's read through the miracle, and then I want to see how is that relevant today. Let's start in Matthew chapter 17, beginning with verse 24, and let's read that together. Jeremy, would you begin reading verse 24 for me, please? Real loud.
Just 24?
24, just begin there. I'll stop you when I need you to stop.
After Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" "Yes, he does," he replied. When Peter came into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. "What do you think, Simon?" he asked. "From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes from, their own sons or from others?"
Now, back then, during this time in Capernaum, their monetary system was the Roman denarii. But in order to make your temple tax and contribute that, they had drachmas. This is not a modern day, this is about a 50-year-old drachma from Greece. And this is 20 drachma. Now, the temple tax was 2 drachma. Just pass that around, Randy. Is 2 drachma. So if 10 people were going to the temple, that would cover all 10 of them. But you had to make your drachma contribution in the temple. So that's what the drachma looks like today in Greece. Well, in the 1960s, it's probably 60, 70 years old. But that's the temple tax that he's talking about here. And it's interesting to see this because these people were gathering taxes for the temple. Now, what would they use it for? Well, they would pay the Levites to keep the temple clean. It would go to feeding the priests and the Levites that were around the temple. So it was used to keep up the building, much like we do here. We keep the building up. We keep it clean. We keep it presentable. We try to keep it presentable for the neighborhood. So we have certain things that we have to have, and the temple tax was one of them back then. And they were all expected to give the temple tax. And Jesus was asked a question. And as you were reading, Jeremy, I thought it might be good for us to look at that question because these tax collectors were asking Jesus because they wanted to trick him. They wanted to make him foul up. They wanted to know if he doesn't give taxes, we can report this to the Romans and they'll take care of him. That's one way of getting rid of him or shutting him up. Well, there's that experience of seeing something like that happening, and Jesus isn't worried about it. He doesn't worry about it. He's not concerned about the question. In fact, whenever there was a question, Jesus always answered with questions. What's the question that they asked Jesus? What was the question they asked Peter? Let's put it that way.
Did Jesus pay the temple tax?
Yeah. The question is, doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax? Wow. How does he answer that question? He answers it with another question. Peter says, yes, he does, and then he goes in to check with Jesus to make sure. Of course he pays the temple tax. Well, what does Jesus say? He doesn't say, yes, we pay the temple tax. He asks Peter a question. What's a question that he asked Peter?
Does the king pay taxes?
Yeah. Does
And
a
the
king
family?
pay taxes? And what's the answer?
No.
No, of course not. The question is moot to Jesus because, why? He's the Son of God. Do you think the Son of God needs to pay taxes? Shake your head no.
No.
No. Jesus doesn't need to pay taxes, but he does. And the interesting thing here is what comes out of it. There's a message behind the words of Jesus. And what happened was this idea of understanding what's going to be taught to Peter and the apostles, because they're all there in Capernaum. There's a lesson that needs to be taught. You know, how many of you remember Jay Leno that was on The Tonight Show? It's been a long time, what, 10 or 15 years ago?
Recently.
Yeah.
Easily.
What was his hobby? Anybody remember what his cars? Antique cars. He's got every car. I didn't know. I didn't realize anybody could be that rich to have that big of a warehouse full of cars, different levels, you know. But the story he tells is when he was in high school, he had an old pickup truck, an old red pickup truck, which he tore apart, rebuilt the engine. Then he finished the body and repainted it. And he drove to school, and it was sitting in the parking lot. And he left the windows down, and it began to rain. And all he could think of was, what's my inside of my truck going to look like when I get out of school today? All of a sudden, he's sitting in class, and his parents drove up and put plastic over his window so no water would get in. And he said, I always respected my parents because they loved me. They cared about me. He never forgot that. And he always took care of his parents and respected them because he now knew how much they cared for him. You know that? And it wasn't so much the truck, it was what they did. You know, they showed up when it began raining to take care of his truck. And he didn't call him on a cell phone. You know, in the 50s there were no cell phones. But that's exactly what happened to him. And it really made an effect on him because it's interesting to see what this lesson taught Jay Leno. Behind that sign, behind the action was very important to him because he knew they cared for him. And I'll never forget reading about that because it showed me not just that Jay Leno cared about his truck, but that his parents cared for him. And Jesus is going to try and teach the apostles a lesson behind the temple tax. I find it interesting that when you think about it, did Jesus heal all of the blind people in Palestine?
No.
Nope. Did he heal all the lame people?
Nope.
How about all the deaf people?
Nope.
He didn't, did he? How about all the paralytics? Nope.
He could have.
He
just
could
like
have.
that.
Yeah, that's the point, Lewis, isn't it? He could have snapped his fingers and everybody in Palestine would have been healed. But he didn't. He chose people to heal, not just to heal people, he wanted his apostles to see. The lessons about healing the blind person is you apostles are blind spiritually. You know? You need to open your eyes. So there was always a lesson behind the miracles that Jesus is teaching. What's the lesson here? Well, if you look at it, you'll see they're an integral part of what happened in Matthew 17. So he's trying to draw them into this to let them know what the lesson is. Now, I know a lot of Christians whose faith are strengthened by the miracles. I don't know that people have been baptized because of the miracles, reading the miracles, but I know it strengthens our faith when we read about the miracles because Jesus is trying to strengthen the faith of his apostles and he's trying to strengthen our faith. That's why we read the miracles. They're to teach us something too. And there's a lesson here to be learned. And so what I find interesting is before the temple tax, we read about the healing of a boy with demon. And before that, we see the three apostles on the Mount of Transfiguration, and Jesus appears to them. And what does God say to them? This is my beloved Son.
To him.
Hear, listen to him. Hear ye him. Listen to him. You know, Elijah and Moses are important, but not like Jesus. So they're wanting them to listen to Jesus. So that's what he's doing. Jesus Christ in the 17th chapter of Gospel of Matthew is trying to teach them something, and it tells us what's going to happen in their own minds. Yeah,
Russ, you
Randy?
bring up a good point. You know, the apostles were just regular folks
Yeah,
like us, but yet they were chosen by Jesus.
yes,
And they didn't have the insight that Jesus had,
yep,
but yet he used them. It's a perfect example for us to see people who are imperfect following
Exactly.
Christ and overcoming their own weaknesses and frailties and remaining faithful till death. I think that I do personally think that's why Jesus chose the men he chose.
yeah,
And that we look at those men and we see, well, they're not perfect. Well, you got to think beyond the end of your nose.
that's right.
No, they're not perfect.
Yeah,
But what did they do with their imperfections? They stayed faithful to Jesus.
amen, amen. What a great lesson. I mean, even though they didn't understand everything that was going on. You know, I overlooked the first part of this miracle. The miracle is not the coin that was in the fish's mouth to pay the temple tax. The first miracle is Jesus, when Peter walked in, he already knew the conversation that took place outside. He knew what was happening. He knew what was said. That's the first miracle in this miracle, is that it happened before he even walked into the house. So this is not a one-part miracle. There's a lot of miracles involved in this. And when you look at it, you'll see that there are things that I believe Peter had to learn. Do you ever wonder why Peter was chosen to go fish?
Fish. That was-
He was a fisherman, yeah. Also, think about this. He may have been the oldest of the apostles. He could have been the oldest of the apostles. But he was told to go out and to catch a fish, and where was he going to get the coin?
Out of the mouth.
Out of the mouth of the fish. The question for me is, do people find things in fish?
Aye.
They've even found coins. Lots of things in fish.
Yeah.
Well, what's a miracle? The miracle is not so much as there was a coin in its mouth, but that was the first fish that he caught. And it was in its mouth.
How many
Tom?
other fish near there didn't have a coin at all?
Yeah. In fact, what we're told is Peter wasn't a fisherman with a line and hook. He was the kind of fisherman who threw nets out. If you ask a fisherman that had a business with a net to go out and catch a single fish, he would, why would I waste my time doing that? Why would I do that?
I
Randy?
think it's interesting that Peter did it first of all.
Yeah.
He'd be the first one to say, what?
Why?
Coin in a fish's mouth? Let me see it.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
That would be Peter.
Yep.
But Peter obeyed.
Yeah, he did.
Well,
He didn't question
No.
the reason why he obeyed was when he walked in and Jesus had already read his mind. Before he could
Yep.
open his mouth, Jesus said, now, by the way, that conversation you were having outside with it, and he just blew him away. From that point on, he would have been listening.
Yeah, in fact, Louis, you bring up a good point. The kind of pattern that was used was you would think Peter would be the first to talk. Jesus was the first to talk because he knew what was going to happen. He knew exactly what was going to happen in this miracle before it even happened. So it's unusual to hear Jesus talk before Peter talked because Peter came in to ask a question when he met the tax collectors. And so Jesus was paying attention to what was happening in another place in Capernaum. And that's the interesting thing. Now, it would have been about $1, the tax. So he found coin that would cover 2 taxes for Peter and Jesus. So probably about $4 maybe. So we can see, depending on inflation, of course. Ed?
I find it interesting in verse 27. where
Oh,
it says,
let's read that, Ed. Pick up where Jeremy left off in verse 20.
Oh, am I getting ahead?
Yeah, read verse 26 to the end of the chapter.
From others, Peter answered, then the children are exempt. Jesus said to him, but so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours.
Go ahead, Ed. You had a point.
Well, I think this kind of stands out to me because Jesus is making another point here, but so that we may not cause offense. Now, I think there are times when we need to do things so that we don't cause offense.
Yeah,
And it may not be something we have to do, but it's something we probably need to do.
yeah,
And that's what I think stands out to me here. Jesus could have went about the way things were, but he said, hold on, go get this, and because we don't want to offend anybody, you go
That's right.
get this coin from the fish.
that's right. Yeah. And it was the first fish, right? Drew?
I know you're focused on Jesus' sign, of being that the sign is here, and what's it for? What's it indicating? So that we may not cause offense, pay the tax, even though the children are exempt, right?
Yeah.
And then chapter 18, it begins with at this time. So if I'm being an exegete, I'm going to tie all this. Maybe chapter 18 should not have begun right here. We gotta just point out those. Well, the words are inspired.
Yep.
The monks are the ones that put the numbers and all that.
That's right.
Chapter 18 teaches us what happens when there's an offense. What do you do? And then it ends. If you look, 18:35.
Read it for us.
This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. And I would propose, just for everybody's personal study, it's so valuable to tie all this together.
That's right.
Because we tend to go to Matthew 18 and we say, well, here's the ordered process for church disfellowship. And okay, we do want to be orderly, I get it. We need a process. We need guidance. But what does Jesus say if we tie this last part of chapter 17? You pay the tax. Yeah, you're exempt from going through this headache with troublemakers and people like this and divisive entities. People like these tax collectors that are in the synagogues. And Jesus doesn't run them out, not in every single case. He overturned
Sure.
the tables. But what did it take for Jesus to get there? He paid the tax,
That's right.
even though he was exempt.
Yep.
And it was so that we don't cause offense ourselves. Because God will provide what you need to pay. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, Drew, I think the point that we're looking at is, and you're right, you know, these chapters weren't in here until the 13th century after Christ. So they didn't have the benefit of having chapters, and many times the chapter headings don't match up with the previous chapter. The chapter division shouldn't have happened there. It should have been later on or before that. But when we look at it, yeah, the question comes to us, the parable of the unmerciful servant is talking about this same issue that they're going through in Matthew 17. Good point.
He's answering the question, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? That's what they come to him with next.
Yeah,
You want to know why these tax collectors exist? It's because you have this hierarchy
that's right.
that really was only given to the Jews because they begged for it. It wasn't because God wanted it to,
Yeah,
for there to be lessers and morers, you know.
exactly.
But
That's it. Yeah, and when you look at it, you see the way that it's designed is to, and you know, in many ways, I think when the chapters were put in here in the 13th century, and then the verses were numbered in the 15th century, I think God may have had a hand in some of it because of the way it's divided. But the thought is, when you look at this story, you can see what Jesus is trying to teach. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you think that Jesus was successful at teaching the apostles to their full faith before he died? I don't think so either. I mean, what happened when the mob took Jesus out of the garden? The apostles ran. They dispersed, you know? So his job wasn't done. But here he is in another episode trying to teach another lesson. Now, and you're right, the thought that here he is trying to say, I don't have to pay this. In fact, he's saying, I'm exempt. Now, wouldn't you love the tax collectors in Cincinnati to say, Russ, don't worry about it this year. You're exempt. No taxes. Wouldn't that be nice? I know some people have done that. There's a group up in Upper Michigan. One of my relatives got involved with them, and they're preaching the word that you don't have to pay taxes. And I told them, I said, Ronnie, okay, I know what you're a part of. I'll come and visit you in jail. Because he's going to jail, you know. Try not paying taxes. Tim?
I was going to say, that's an 800-pound gorilla you're going up against.
Yes, yes.
Just
Don't
got
make the
86,000
tax
more.
man mad.
They just hired 86,000 more to come after you.
Yeah, they just hired a lot more. That's right, thousands. So, but Jesus says, I'm exempt. Of course he is. He's the Son of God. He's the Son of the Almighty in heaven. He doesn't have to pay this, but he does. And there's a lesson there for the apostles, a lesson for us. We're going to learn that in just a moment. But I wanted to go through this to see what happens here. The miracle is the fish. The miracle is the first fish. He opened it and he found the 4 drachma coin in the mouth of the fish. And what's interesting, Jesus wasn't made to pay taxes. And Jesus didn't want to pay this tax so that he would not offend. He wanted to pay the tax so he'd get along with people. Why do I need to pay this tax? I don't. But how am I going to influence people here if I don't, in their eyes, follow the law and do something that's reasonable and interesting? Well, that's what he says here. Letter A, if you look at the text, is God's will. There's 2 wills here. God's will is between God and us, and we always keep his law, right? Well, we always maintain that relationship and will always obey God. Letter B, there's another law between us and our mankind, our fellow humans. That's another law that we have to be careful about. You know, one of the things I can assure you is if you join one of those groups that doesn't pay taxes, your influence on people is not going to be good because they see somebody that's a lawbreaker. Romans 13 tells us to pay our taxes. It's not a suggestion. Paul said you need to do it. Now he's talking about the Roman government, and they're supposed to follow the Roman law, and he's trying to tell them that we have to maintain that relationship between ourselves and others. And that's why people meant so much to Jesus. He didn't want to offend them so Peter and the disciples would understand what was going on. It's our duty to conduct ourselves in all manners where we have superior knowledge so as not to offend others, so we can bring them to Christ. And that's why we need to follow the laws of the land. We need to do what the law says to our best ability. Our influence will be affected by how we conduct ourselves in Lincoln Park. Do we need to follow all of the laws on our streets? We do, don't we? We were driving to worship this morning, and we were going down Goddard, and you know where Old Goddard and Goddard divide? That red light there is just a suggestion.
Or the one that makes the right?
Yeah, going right. Nobody stops there. I was watching them. Some of them don't even slow down. So that red light doesn't mean red light to most people. It amazes me that there's not a police officer sitting there and pulling people over. But it's like it's just a suggestion. Now, that's how it was in Cairo. When you put 14 million people in one city, Nobody stops at a red light. It's just a suggestion. Every red light. It's like you go until the people pull in front of you, then you stop. And then you go, and it's crazy. It's chaos because the red lights in Cairo, Egypt don't mean anything. Those people don't follow those things. It pertains to somebody else, not me. So there's no following laws in the city of Cairo. It's every person for themselves. But that's what Jesus is trying to make a point here, is if we're going to maintain our reputation here on earth, then we have to watch out how we conduct ourselves, how we act, how we live, the taxes we pay. That's what Jesus is getting at here, and that's why I wanted us to look at this, because there's other things that happen here that you've never seen before. In fact, the coin Peter found in the fish's mouth is an example. Any fisherman knows that all kinds of things are found in the mouths and bellies of fish. But this is one of the great miracles of the Bible, is because the fact that Jesus' ministry was not just to teach the disciples a lesson, but to teach us a lesson and the temple tax collectors a lesson, that he was going to do it, even though he didn't have to. He felt that he needed to do it. And that's why, Randy, did you? Okay. So I want us to think about this, because we have to discern, just like Peter and Paul, the apostles, the early church, how we live in our communities. How do we live here? What do we do? How do our neighbors see us? Do they see us living by the law? I want my kids to see me living by the law. I want them to know that I follow the law. They should follow the law. That's why I think if Christianity was as broad and broad-based in America as it used to be, I think there'd be more law followers, don't you? More people would follow the law. Lewis?
I think Jesus had one other big picture moment for Peter. Jesus always said, my time has not come yet.
Yeah.
And he could have stopped and said, hey, you go out there and tell that guy, I'm not going to pay him, I'm the Son of God, blah, 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 blah. It would have distorted everything he was doing.
That's right.
Jesus saw the big picture.
Yep.
Peter didn't understand it, but he was teaching a lesson. I have a purpose here. It's not time. This is just a little battle here.
Yeah.
The war is for me to make sure you get as much information as you can and go on with my work. And that was a subtle thing that sometimes is not seen in the big picture.
Exactly, yeah. And he does look at the big picture, doesn't he? In fact, the point of this matter, too, is there are at least 5 miracles in this one miracle. Number 1 is there's a coin in the fish's mouth, and it's the first fish he caught. Number 2, it was exactly the amount that Jesus needed to pay his tax and Peter's tax. Number 3, it was the first fish. Number 4, Jesus read their minds before they got into the house. That's another miracle. And then, number 5 is the fact that he was able to continue his relationship with mankind. What would have happened if Jesus hadn't paid the temple tax? The tax collectors would have done what? What do you suppose?
And a raid.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
He would have been, first of all, he would have been taken into custody, probably.
Yep.
And they would have probably tried to end his
Yeah.
by keeping him in prison or
Yeah.
and away from what he needed to do.
Exactly. In fact, at the very first miracle, he told his mom, my time hasn't come yet. He didn't want to start his ministry yet. He was always that way because he told people that he healed, keep your mouth shut, don't tell anybody about this. But they did. So there were times where he tried to broadcast, I'm trying to do this, my ministry hasn't started yet. Because he knew the Romans would interfere with his ministry if he didn't pay the tax. So this is what I want to leave you with, though, in the last 10 minutes. I want to discuss this. What do you think the age of the apostles would have been? I put a picture up here on the screen of the apostles and Jesus. Is that what they looked like? Shake your head no. I don't read any account of them sitting down for a photographer, do you? This is just a mock-up of what people think they look like. That's far from what they look like. And most people read through this miracle and don't realize this is false. I looked all over the internet and I couldn't find a decent picture or mock-up of what the apostles looked like. Did you know, and I did some research, a lot of research actually, this is the most important thing to me, is that the apostles were anywhere from the age of 13 to 15 years old. The Bible proves that. Peter was the only apostle that paid a tax. Why? What about the other 11? They didn't have to pay a tax. They weren't even 20 years old. And the tax starts when you're 20. So we know they were teenagers. They weren't just teenagers, they were probably 13 to 15 years old, what my search found out. Think about 13 and 15-year-old boys. And one of the proofs on the internet was, what were two of the apostles doing when Jesus told them to follow him? They were mending their father's net. They were kids. They were with their father's boat. They left their father's business. Think about a 13 or 15-year-old child. As soon as Jesus called them, they went home and told their mom and dad, Rabbi wants me to follow him, which would have been an honor. But up until the age of 15, these kids would have been meeting every Friday behind the synagogue and learning to speak Hebrew and learning the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the Torah. So they were expected to learn the Torah by the time they were 15. So these kids, and they probably weren't linguistic, they weren't gifted like some of the rabbis became, these kids that were rabbis later on. But think about this. If Peter was the only apostle to have to pay taxes, that means the other kids were younger than Peter. It puts a whole different spin on this discipleship, where Jesus is trying to bring these disciples of his, the apostles, into his ministry, doesn't it? These kids, and you wonder why they were acting the way they did? They were so young. And it also tells me, we have a lot of kids here that are 13 and 15 years old that could be doing more than they're doing. And we need to expect it, Roxanne?
Do you think that's why in Jewish culture still today, that at 13 the boys
Yep.
become men and they have the bar mitzvah?
That's right.
Yes, bar mitzvah.
Until you turn 15, you can't even help with the sacrifice at the Passover. So, for them to be 15, that's the point at which they're entering this point of where they can participate in some of the things at the Passover. So now I think don't you get a better appreciation of who the apostles were when you realize how young they were? Mm-hmm. Peter was over 20.
He was married.
Yeah, he was married, and they probably married young too back then.
Well,
I'm sure.
15,
Yeah.
they became a man.
Oh yeah. Well,
sort of. As
yeah,
we
and
were
sort of.
considered
Jesus became a man at 30. Most Jews become men at 30. But yeah, at 20 you start paying your temple tax. At 15, you're ready to get married. I mean, you're starting your families. So it gives us a better appreciation on what it meant for Peter to be the only apostle to have to pay a temple tax. And it tells us a little bit about the apostles. What is it? I don't see anybody there that looks 15, do you?
He shaved a little late.
No, they had good barbers.
Yeah.
Good
Yeah.
skincare.
I don't know.
Pretty good beards. Drew?
In 6th grade, I literally had 2 classmates with full beards.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. dead
Wow.
serious. I mean,
Oh.
part of that is also how they were raised. I mean,
Oh,
these
yeah.
Kids were
Sure.
sons of ranchers. They worked. And George Washington, I love the history on it. At 14, was in the hills of Virginia, using higher math, doing surveying. This is wilderness.
Yeah.
So you got to infer he's trapping, he's hunting his own food. 14 years old, and he's working a full-time job, risking his life in the wild at 14. The expectation, I mean, we got to realize how we reverse construct based on our own lines that we put on adulthood.
That's right.
And it's maybe something we should consider. Jesus kept a youth group with him.
Yep.
And in large part because it's young, moldable, impressionable minds.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we should take notes from that.
Yeah.
Adjust accordingly. Like where should we be sinking the majority of our energy into now that I'm clearly an adult now. You know, it's
yeah. It's so true.
And yeah, you mentioned expectations, and I think I don't find it unreasonable at all.
In fact, Drew, I think when you look at the history of the church, by Acts chapter 8, the church was all still in Jerusalem, and then persecution broke up, and everybody left Jerusalem except the apostles. Now, at that time, 10 years, 3 years of Jesus' ministry, 10 years, they're 13 years older. They're probably close to 30 by the time that the church has dispersed in Acts chapter 8. So it's a whole new beginning for the church and the apostles. They're now adults, finally. But think about going from teenager to an adult as an apostle. It puts a whole new spin on this idea of who the apostles were, I think. They needed to learn from Peter paying his temple tax in this miraculous way so that they would have the example, the apostles, I need to be a good citizen. So you can see how this lesson is. There's so many parts to this miracle, but I think you get the gist of what Jesus is trying to teach them. Ed?
I think it speaks to the wisdom of God as well, because his plan was to use them from the beginning, and they used them for their entire lives.
He's paying me for the class. Look at that.
When God chose them when they're young, so he used it every bit of their whole lives.
Yep.
When they were old men, he was still using them.
Yeah,
So they started out so he could get a full...
Think about that. That's just amazing. To be an apostle, to live that long and be that disciple of Jesus that long. They've been there quite a while. What an experience. Thank you, Ed. Let's have closing prayer. Father, thank you for our lesson from the miracle of Jesus. Father, help us to learn what he's trying to teach us, not only to pay our taxes, but to make sure that we have a plan B, and that is to get along with fellow man so that we can make a difference in their lives. And Father, we're grateful that we can see the impact that Jesus had on these young teenagers as his apostles. And bless us, Father, this day. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Russ.
Mm-hmm. Does this go up there?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Russ. That's good class.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think so. Oh, thank you.
Russ, I have to tell you just a real short, quick story what happened to me yesterday. My car, I thought was on a power steering fluid, so I went to a neighborhood shop by my house. Here a guy comes out, says, what do you need to check? He says, no, it doesn't need anything. Let me check your oil. Yeah, he was really thorough. So I want to give him a $5 tip. He says, oh, no, I can't take that. I said, why not? I says, I just want to give you a little thing. He says, oh, no. He says, that's what we're supposed to do. Give it to one another. He says, we're not here that long. He says, we're not here on this for that long. I said, we're not here. That's what Jesus said. I said, Jesus said the same thing. He says, when you get up to heaven, he says to you, I don't, Father, he says, I don't know. What did you do? Did you give stuff? Did you help the poor? Did you give some food? Did you give water? He says, wait a minute. This is what he did. He ran in the shop. He brought me a bottle of water. I says, no, I didn't tell you that for that reason. He says, no, I just thought you're going to be on the road, you're driving, you might be thirsty. I said, God bless you. I said, God bless you. He said, God bless you. They do this. You know, they do this. I thought that was the sweetest thing on Monroe. An hour drive. It was right, there's a church across. I was like, what a witness. He says, we're not here that long. how many Americans do you hear say, "Oh, we're not here that long"?
Pretty darn good, thanks, Fred.
We have to be kind to one another. He says, you know, that's what's wrong with the world. We have to be kind to one another. He says, it's to be good to one another. Isn't that beautiful? I mean, so many, I told him, since he's got familiar with Dearborn and so many of them, the Middle Eastern culture, they're very kind. They're very generous. They're very kind. I thought it was the power steering wheel. He says, no, it's fine. He says, your oil could use an oil change soon. He says, come see me next week. I said, you know, I'm going to come see you. What a witness. Wasn't that lovely? I know he could have said, and you know, he could have said, oh yeah, you need this or that. Let me, he says, no, your oil. And he came out and showed me, Russ, on my oil. He says, look, it's a little bit. He says, you should probably have it done. I says, well, when should I come back? He says, next week's good. So nice. So there's a church here on Monroe, in Outer Drive, and then the gas station's here. Actually, it's a good service station. So kind. I ran into that water right there. Wasn't that funny? You never know when the Lord's going to open a door. You know, he's going to open it. And you listen when I told him what Jesus, you know, this is what Jesus said. He witnessed to me. You know what? If everybody heard that,